She cracked one real egg into the bowl, not knowing that egg was never really about the cake. It was about her. The vanished baking secret hiding in a cardboard box still works in your kitchen today. This was the decade when American baking split in two. On one side, a new wave of boxed convenience promising a cake in 30 minutes. On the other, the sifted flour, hand-tested ovens, and soured milk tricks homemakers had carried since the Depression. Both lived in the same kitchen, often on the same afternoon, and the tension between them shaped how an entire generation learned to bake. Sugar rationing did not end until the middle of 1947, so when it finally lifted, home bakers treated flour and sugar like they had been handed something precious. Kitchens that had spent years stretching every ounce suddenly had abundance again, and women who had learned to bake through scarcity now had the freedom to bake for pleasure. That memory of scarcity never fully left the recipes. General Mills put Betty Crocker cake mix on shelves in the late 1940s, and by the early 1950s, it was everywhere. But the very first mixes flopped. They used powdered egg, so all a homemaker had to add was water, and something about that felt wrong to the women buying it. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and it turned out the company had to learn it from her. The story, as it has been told for decades, involves a market researcher named Ernest Dichter, hired to figure out why women resisted a cake that required almost no effort. His conclusion was that baking a cake was never just about the cake. It was about care, about proof that she had done something with her hands for her family. A cake that asked nothing of her felt like a lie. So General Mills changed the formula. They pulled the powdered egg out of the box and asked the homemaker to crack a real one in herself. Sales climbed. It sounds like a marketing trick, and in part it was. But real eggs genuinely do make a better cake than dried egg powder. Richer crumb, better rise, deeper flavor. The psychology and the chemistry happened to agree with each other. That is the first vanished secret worth carrying forward. If an old family recipe or a box mix ever feels flat or thin, adding one real egg where the instructions call for none, or an extra yolk where they call for one, still deepens flavor and structure the same way it did in 1953. It disappeared from most modern shortcuts, but it still works. Before the mixes ever arrived, though, there was flour, and flour in the 1950s was not treated the way we treat it now. A woman would sift it, sometimes twice, sometimes a third time combined with the baking powder and salt, before it ever touched a measuring cup. It was not about lumps. It was about air, and about making the measurement actually mean something. Flour settles hard in a bag or a bin, and food historians commonly estimate that a cup scooped straight from an unsifted bag can pack in noticeably more flour, sometimes cited around a fifth to a quarter more, than a cup that has been properly sifted and spooned in loosely. That difference throws off the whole ratio of flour to fat to liquid, and a cake meant to be tender turns out dry and tough instead. That is the second secret. If you have ever pulled out your grandmother's recipe card and had it come out dense or dry, it may not be the recipe at all. It may be that she assumed you would sift, and you scooped straight from the bag the way we all do now. Sift first, spoon it in loosely, level it off, and that old recipe often comes right back to life. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and cake flour is a small piece of it. A 1950s baker reaching for angel food or a delicate layer cake did not grab the same bag of flour she used for biscuits. She reached for cake flour, a finer, lower protein flour sold under names like Swans Down or Softasilk, both of which are still sitting on grocery shelves today, largely unchanged. Cake flour has less protein than all-purpose flour, which means less gluten forms when it is mixed, which means a softer, finer crumb. Bread and biscuits want structure and chew, so they got the sturdier flour. Delicate sponge and angel food wanted tenderness, so they got the softer one. It was never a fussy distinction. It was the difference between a cake that melted on the fork and one that did not. Angel food cake asked for more than the right flour. It asked for a spotless bowl, a single trace of egg yolk, A smear of butter, even a film of oil, left on a towel used to dry the beaters, could keep the egg whites from whipping into the stiff white peaks the cake depended on. Home economists of the era repeated this warning constantly, because it was the single most common reason a cake fell flat. Some kitchens went a step further and whipped their egg whites in a copper bowl, and this one was never just superstition. Copper reacts with a protein in egg white and helps the foam hold its shape longer without collapsing or turning grainy. It sounds like an old wives' tale. It is real chemistry, and professional bakers still keep a copper bowl in the cupboard for exactly this reason. So that is the third vanished secret, and it is one you can use tonight. If a delicate cake or a meringue keeps falling apart on you, check the bowl before you blame the recipe. Wash it with vinegar or lemon juice to strip any invisible grease, dry it completely. And if you happen to own a copper bowl, use it. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Ovens were the quiet villain of 1950s baking. Many home ovens of the era had dials that bore only a loose relationship to what was actually happening inside. And a cookbook that told you 350 degrees was really only a suggestion the oven might or might not agree with. A whole generation of bakers learned to distrust the dial and trust their own senses instead. Some women tested heat by holding a hand inside the open oven and counting seconds before it grew uncomfortable. Others sprinkled a pinch of flour on the oven floor and watched how fast it browned. Neither method sounds precise by modern standards, but they were often more accurate than the dial itself, and they meant a baker could catch a scorching oven before it ruined an entire cake. Modern ovens are dramatically better than they were then, and yet the underlying problem never fully disappeared. Oven thermometer manufacturers today still point out that a home oven can run well off its own dial setting, sometimes by a wide enough margin to undercook or scorch a cake without the baker ever knowing why. The fourth secret is simple. An inexpensive oven thermometer still catches what the dial will not. There is a rhythm to how families passed this knowledge along, and it rarely involved a printed cookbook at all. Church basements and community halls produced their own recipe collections through the 1950s. Spiral-bound, mimeographed, sold at fundraisers, each recipe credited to the woman who brought it. Mrs. Jensen's Buttermilk Cake, Mrs. Halvorson's Spice Bars. These were not polished cookbooks. They were a neighborhood's memory, held together with a plastic comb binding. What is easy to miss is how much those recipes left unsaid. They rarely specified an exact oven temperature because they assumed the cook already knew to test the heat herself. They rarely explained how to sift because sifting was simply what you did. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart, and that unwritten knowledge is exactly what got lost once the ovens got reliable and the mixes got easy. Buttermilk deserves its own moment here, because the buttermilk in a 1950s kitchen was not always what we picture today. In plenty of homes, it was still a genuine byproduct of churning butter, tangy and thin, not the thick, cultured product sold in cartons now. Bakers reached for it constantly in biscuits, cakes, and quick breads, not for flavor alone, but because of what it did chemically once it met baking soda. Buttermilk is acidic, and baking soda needs an acid to react against. When the two meet, they release carbon dioxide right there in the batter, which is what gives old-fashioned biscuits and cakes their particular light, tender lift, along with a faint tang modern recipes rarely bother to chase anymore. It was never just a flavor choice. It was the engine that made the whole recipe rise the way it was supposed to. Here is the fifth secret, and it might be the most useful one in this whole video. If you do not keep buttermilk on hand, stir a spoonful of vinegar or lemon juice into a cup of regular milk and let it sit for a few minutes until it thickens slightly. It disappeared from store shelves in most kitchens decades ago as a habit, but it still works, and modern test kitchens recommend the exact same trick today. Fat told its own story in that decade. Crisco had been around since 1911, but the 1950s were really its golden age, marketed hard as clean, modern, and more digestible than the lard or butter a woman's own mother might have used. Procter & Gamble printed recipe booklets by the millions, and a can of Crisco became a fixture in nearly every American pantry, whether the household baked from scratch or leaned on a mix. It is worth being honest here rather than nostalgic. Hydrogenated shortening is not a health food by today's standards, and plenty of 1950s baking leaned on more sugar and more fat than a modern recipe would recommend. The value in these old techniques was never that the ingredients were better for you. It was that the hands using them understood exactly how each ingredient behaved, and that understanding is worth remembering even now. Baking powder itself went through a quiet revolution that most people never notice. Older single-acting powders released their gas the moment they got wet, which meant a batter had to go into the oven almost immediately or lose its rise. Double-acting powder, the kind that became the mid-century standard, releases gas twice, once when it is mixed, and again when it hits the oven's heat, giving a much more forgiving margin for error. Calumet and Clabber Girl were the two names every 1950s pantry seemed to have, and both are still sold today. Essentially the same formula. That continuity matters, because it means when a recipe from 1953 calls for a teaspoon of baking powder, you can reach for the same brand your grandmother did and trust it will behave the way the recipe expects. Not every kitchen product from that decade can say that. Margarine carried a strange little ritual of its own in some states. Dairy industry lobbying had kept laws on the books banning or taxing pre-colored margarine well into the 1950s in certain places, so a homemaker might bring home a plain white block of margarine along with a small dye capsule and knead the color through herself at the kitchen table before it ever went near a mixing bowl. It is a small, almost forgotten detail, but it says something larger about the era. Even something as simple as the color of your baking fat could be shaped by state law and dairy lobbying, and the homemaker was the one left to do the actual labor of making it presentable. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and it remembers the compromises tucked into ordinary ingredients like this one, before refrigerators became standard in every home. And even for a while after, some households still relied on older cooling methods to keep a fresh baked pie or loaf safe. A pie safe, a ventilated wooden cabinet with punch tin panels on the doors, let air circulate while keeping flies and insects out, and it was common enough in rural and small-town homes that it lingered well into this decade. What makes the pie safe worth pausing on is that it was never purely functional. The tin panels were often hand-punched into regional folk patterns, stars, hearts, tulips, turning a piece of everyday kitchen equipment into something closer to folk art. A woman baking a pie and setting it to cool in that cabinet was, without necessarily thinking of it that way, living alongside a small, handmade artwork every single day. Not every 1950s kitchen looked the same, and that matters more than most nostalgia content admits. A rural farmhouse kitchen with a wood or coal stove, a root cellar, and a pie safe operated on a completely different rhythm than a new suburban kitchen with an electric range and a shiny refrigerator freezer. Both were the 1950s. Neither one alone tells the whole story of how American women baked during this decade. County extension agents were often the bridge between those two worlds. These were women with home economics training, employed by the USDA's Extension Service, who traveled out to rural communities to teach canning, preserving, and baking technique in person, sometimes right on a farmhouse porch or in a church kitchen. A great deal of what we now call lost knowledge was never written in a book to begin with. It was taught hand to hand. That person-to-person teaching is part of why this knowledge vanished so completely once it stopped being necessary. A book stays on a shelf whether or not anyone reads it. A technique that only lives in someone's hands disappears the moment nobody is there to watch her do it and ask why. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and a surprising amount of it was never meant to be written down at all. Depression-era habits did not vanish the moment rationing ended. Women who had baked through the 1930s and through World War II scarcity carried substitution tricks with them long after sugar and butter became easy to find again. Extra baking soda when eggs were short, corn syrup or honey standing in for part of the sugar, bacon drippings or lard doing the work butter usually did. These were not weaknesses in a recipe. They were solved problems, carried forward out of habit. One of the strangest survivors of this thrift instinct is mayonnaise chocolate cake, a recipe that sounds unappetizing until you understand the chemistry. Mayonnaise is really just eggs, oil, and a touch of vinegar already emulsified together, which means a spoonful stirred into chocolate cake batter is quietly doing the job of fat and egg and a little acid all at once, without anyone needing to measure the three separately. It sounds like a rationing era trick with no business surviving into abundance, and yet the recipe never really disappeared. Community cookbooks kept printing it well into the 1950s and beyond, not as an act of desperation, but because it produced a genuinely moist, rich cake. It disappeared from store shelves as a phrase you would ever see on packaging, but it still works exactly the way it did the first time someone needed it to. Let's talk about the mixer for a moment, because the tool in a woman's hand shaped the technique as much as any ingredient did. Electric stand mixers, like the Sunbeam Mixmaster and the KitchenAid, were gaining real traction in American homes through the 1950s, but plenty of kitchens still relied on a hand-crank egg beater or simply a wooden spoon and elbow effort, especially outside wealthier suburbs. That gap in equipment meant instructions like beat until stiff peaks form or cream until light and fluffy carried very different meanings depending on which household you walked into. A woman with a stand mixer might reach that point in 3 minutes. A woman with a hand beater might work for 10. The recipe assumed you would know your own arms and your own tools well enough to judge doneness by look and feel, not by a timer. That instinct for judging doneness by look and feel, rather than a strict number, is the sixth secret worth carrying into your own kitchen. A cake tester or toothpick coming out clean, a batter that ribbons and holds its shape. For a moment when you lift the beater, whipped cream that stands in a firm peak rather than a droop, these visual cues still tell you more than a stopwatch ever will, no matter what appliance you own. Wonder Bread had been sliced and sold since 1930, and by the 1950s, commercial white bread dominated city grocery shelves, soft, uniform, and endlessly convenient. And yet home bread baking never fully disappeared, especially in small towns and rural households, where a Saturday loaf baked at home was still considered simply better, worth the hours of kneading and rising that a plastic-wrapped loaf skipped entirely. Kneading bread by hand teaches something a mixer never fully can, which is the exact feel of gluten developing under your palms, smooth and elastic instead of sticky and rough. Women who baked bread weekly developed that sense the way a seamstress develops a feel for fabric, entirely through repetition. And it is a kind of expertise that rarely gets called expertise at all, simply because it happened in a kitchen instead of an office. Let's slow down on the cake mix boom itself for a moment, because its scale is easy to underestimate. Food historians commonly estimate that by the mid-1950s, something in the range of 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 American cakes was made from a boxed mix rather than entirely from scratch. A genuinely fast shift for a country that had been baking from raw ingredients for generations. That number should be read carefully rather than treated as an exact census figure. Historians cite it as a commonly repeated estimate rather than a single hard statistic, but even taken loosely, it tells you the shift was neither small nor slow.
Wow.
Within roughly a decade, the boxed cake mix went from a shaky new product with an unappealing formula to a fixture in a huge share of American pantries. Betty Crocker herself is worth pausing on, because she was never a real woman baking in a real kitchen. She was invented by General Mills in 1921, a composite signature built from several female employees, given a face and a warm, reassuring voice through radio programs and later television. By the 1950s, she had become one of the most recognized names in America, all in service of making a corporation feel like a trusted friend in the kitchen. There is something almost touching about that invention when you sit with it. A company needed to earn trust from women who already trusted their own mothers and grandmothers more than any brand, so it built a fictional woman who could stand in that same role. It worked because the homemakers she spoke to were not naive. They simply wanted expertise delivered the way expertise had always come to them, warmly and person to person. Duncan Hines entered the mix category a bit later than Betty Crocker and Pillsbury. In 1951, after Procter & Gamble purchased the rights to use the well-known name of a real traveling food critic. Duncan Hines himself had built his reputation reviewing restaurants and lodging across the country through the 1930s and 40s, so his name lent an air of trusted taste to a product he had nothing to do with actually formulating. By the late 1950s, the mix aisle had grown crowded, and each brand tried to distinguish itself with a slightly different promise: more chocolate, more moisture, a fluffier frosting packet included in the box. Underneath the competition, though, the core chemistry stayed remarkably similar. Flour, sugar, leavening, shortening, all pre-measured and stabilized to survive months on a shelf, waiting for a homemaker to add the ingredients that made it feel like hers again. Vanilla itself carried more weight in 1950s baking than most people realize today. Pure vanilla extract, made by steeping actual vanilla beans in alcohol, was standard in serious baking, prized specifically for the complexity a good extract added: floral, slightly boozy, warm. Imitation vanilla existed and was cheaper, but a homemaker baking for company generally reached for the real bottle, because the difference was obvious the moment the cake came out of the oven. That instinct still holds up completely today. Pure vanilla extract remains meaningfully more expensive than imitation, and it remains meaningfully better in a cake or a batch of cookies, precisely for the same reason it mattered then: more genuine complexity from real vanilla bean compounds instead of a single synthetic flavor note standing in for the whole thing. Seventh secret: the bottle marked pure is worth the extra cost, exactly the way it always was. Spices tell a similar story of quiet care. A 1950s homemaker baking cinnamon rolls or spice cake often bought whole nutmeg and grated it fresh with a small hand grater kept in a kitchen drawer specifically for that purpose, rather than reaching for a jar of pre-ground spice that had likely been sitting on a shelf losing potency for months. Freshly grated nutmeg carries a brighter, sharper aroma than the ground version most kitchens default to now. Pre-ground spices lose their essential oils steadily over time, sometimes noticeably within just a few months on the shelf, which is why a spice cake made with fresh grated nutmeg or cinnamon ground closer to baking day tastes distinctly more vivid than the same recipe made with spices that have been sitting in the cupboard for years. It disappeared from store shelves as a common habit, but it still works, and it costs almost nothing extra to try. Cookie baking in this decade leaned heavily on drop cookies and bar cookies, oatmeal, molasses, sugar cookies rolled in cinnamon sugar, partly because they were forgiving of an inconsistent oven, and partly because they stretched simple pantry staples into something a family actually looked forward to. A tin of cookies on the counter was a near-constant fixture in many households, refilled weekly rather than treated as a special occasion food. Molasses itself deserves a mention because it was cheaper than refined sugar for much of American history and carried real nutritional trace minerals that white sugar lacks, iron and calcium among them, though nobody baked with molasses in the 1950s thinking of it as a health ingredient. They used it because it was affordable, because it kept cookies soft for days, and because the flavor was simply what a spice cookie was supposed to taste like. Let's pause on canning for a moment, because it sat right alongside baking in a 1950s kitchen's yearly rhythm. Late summer meant jars lined up on the counter, peaches, tomatoes, green beans, preserved through boiling water baths or pressure canning, following USDA extension bulletins that specified processing times down to the minute for safety. This was not a hobby. It was how a family ate through winter. That same precision carried over into baking with preserved fruit. A jar of home-canned peaches or cherries, put up in late summer, became the filling for a winter pie months later, meaning a baker had to think about her February dessert while she was still standing over a hot stove in August. It was planning measured in seasons, not in the single afternoon most modern baking asks of us now. Women's magazines carried enormous weight in shaping what actually got baked in an average American home through this decade. Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, and Better Homes and Gardens ran monthly recipe features tested in their own dedicated kitchens, and a recipe that appeared in one of these magazines could show up in kitchens across the entire country within the same season, an early version of a viral recipe moment. These test kitchens functioned much the way a modern recipe developer's kitchen does now, refining a formula through repeated trials before it ever reached a reader's oven. The difference is that a 1950s test kitchen recipe had to work reliably across wildly inconsistent home ovens and mismatched equipment nationwide, which is part of why the techniques themselves, sifting, hand-testing heat, watching for visual cues, mattered so much. The recipe alone was never enough. Refrigerated tube biscuit dough, the kind you pop open with a small pressurized snap, arrived from Pillsbury in the 1950s and represented an entirely new category of convenience, ready-made dough that only needed baking. It's sold well, but it never fully replaced the older habit of cutting biscuits from a hand-mixed dough, especially among women who felt, much like with the cake mix, that a biscuit ought to come from her own hands to really count. Handling biscuit dough gently was its own quiet skill, one home economics teachers repeated constantly. Overworking the dough develops gluten the same way kneading bread does, and gluten is exactly what you do not want in a tender, flaky biscuit. A light hand, minimal handling, and cold fat cut into the flour rather than melted or softened, that combination is what separated a biscuit that shattered apart from one that came out heavy and tough. That cold fat technique is the eighth secret, and it is still exactly how the best modern biscuit and pie crust recipes work. Keep the butter or shortening cold, cut it into the flour until it looks like coarse crumbs rather than smoothing it in completely, and handle the dough as little as possible. It disappeared from a lot of casual modern baking simply because it takes more attention than a store-bought dough, but it still works precisely the way it did in 1954. Pie crust followed the same cold fat logic, and a good 1950s pie crust recipe often specified ice water, added just a spoonful at a time, enough to bring the dough together without ever letting it turn warm or sticky. A woman baking for a church supper or a holiday table judged her crust by touch, pressing it gently to see if it would hold together rather than by any measurement printed on a card. Let's talk briefly about the deeper cultural weight baking carried in this decade, because it was rarely just about feeding a family. A well-made pie brought to a church supper, a cake baked for a new neighbor, a batch of cookies sent with a child to school. These were small, constant acts of community currency, ways women built and maintained relationships through the work of their hands, long before anyone called it social currency at all. That context matters for understanding why so many of these techniques carried real emotional weight rather than being treated as mere instructions. A cake that fell, a crust that turned tough, was not simply a cooking failure. It reflected, fairly or not, on a woman's care and competence in front of her community, which is part of why the sifting, the hand testing, the clean bowl, all of it, got passed down with such careful insistence. It is worth naming plainly that this pressure was not entirely fair, and this channel has no interest in pretending the 1950s were some flawless golden age for the women living through them. There was real domestic pressure, real judgment, real limits on what women were expected to do with their days. What deserves respect is not the pressure itself. It is the genuine skill and care women built inside those limits, skill that still holds up on its own merits. Let's return to the mixes one more time, because there is a final layer to that story worth including. As mixes and convenience products grew more common through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, many of the hedge against unreliable equipment techniques, the repeated sifting, the hand-tested oven, the copper bowl ritual, quietly stopped being necessary for most households as ovens and appliances improved, and so they simply faded from everyday teaching. That is really the whole premise of Vanished, but Still Working. These were never outdated superstitions that stopped functioning. They were precise, hard-won solutions to real problems: unreliable ovens, inconsistent flour measurement, unstable egg whites. And once the problems mostly disappeared, the solutions stopped getting taught, even though every one of them still works exactly as well on a cake today as it did on a cake in 1955. Let's gather the secrets together for a moment, because there are 8 worth carrying into your own kitchen. Crack a real egg into a mix for richer flavor. Sift and spoon your flour instead of scooping. Use cake flour for delicate cakes. Keep your bowl spotless or reach for copper when whipping egg whites. Check your oven with a real thermometer. Sour your own milk when you are out of buttermilk. Choose pure vanilla and fresh spice. Keep your fat ice cold for pastry. None of these require special equipment beyond what most kitchens already have, and none of them cost more than a few extra minutes. That was always the real secret underneath the secrets. Good baking in this decade was rarely about rare ingredients or expensive tools. It was about attention, the kind that notices when a bowl still has a trace of grease on it, or when flour has settled too tightly into its bag. There is renewed interest in exactly this kind of attentive, ingredient-smart baking right now, and it is not hard to understand why. Grocery costs have pushed a lot of households back towards stretching what they have and making things from scratch, the same instinct that shaped kitchens in the 1950s, even if the reasons behind it look a little different in 2026 than they did 70 years ago. Modern test kitchens, the same kind of rigorous trial and error kitchens that Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping ran decades ago, keep circling back to confirm these old techniques on their own terms. Accurate oven thermometers, real buttermilk or a soured substitute, sifted flour for delicate cakes, copper bowls for egg whites, all still recommended today, not out of nostalgia, but because the food science genuinely holds up under testing. So the next time a recipe from your own mother or grandmother comes out wrong, consider that the recipe was probably never the problem. It may simply be waiting for the sifted flour, the tested oven, the real egg, the ice-cold butter, the small pieces of attention that got quietly dropped somewhere between her kitchen and yours, without anyone ever deciding to drop them on purpose. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, tucked into church basement cookbooks, punched tin pie safes, dye capsules kneaded into margarine, and a woman's own hand held inside a hot oven, counting seconds. None of it made it into a textbook. Almost all of it still works, quietly, in any kitchen willing to slow down enough to notice it. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget. And that is really the whole point of sitting with these old techniques, rather than simply admiring them from a distance. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, not because it was ever a secret in the dramatic sense, but because nobody thought to write down what everybody already understood how to do with her own 2 hands. If any of this made you want to go pull out an old recipe card and actually test it, sift the flour, warm the butter to cold instead of soft, crack in one real egg, that is exactly what this channel is for. Tell me in the comments which of these secrets you already knew, and which one belonged to a woman in your own family. I will see you in the next kitchen we uncover together.